All right, welcome to Masters of Military Science Fiction here in our virtual LibertyCon. My name is Gary Poole. I'm going to be the ringmaster of this circus, and we have got three gentlemen that know just a little bit about military and science fiction and the intersections thereof. In no particular order, David Weber, John Ringo, and Tom Kratman all joining us here. Good evening, gentlemen.
Hi there.
So let's see. David is you're streaming from a condo. Tom is obviously in his office, and John apparently
I'm in my South American prison cell.
where you've been for the last year.
The beard is coming along nicely. I got the Santa curls.
You do have the curls are. I had no idea that your beard would curl.
Neither did I, because I've never grown one out this far. The longest it's ever been is about the length of David's. And so I just decided to keep going and see what happened. And it turns out I become Thorin.
All right. So the title of the panel is Masters of Military Science Fiction. And between the three of you, let's see here. Obviously, Colonel Kratman, you've had some experience in the real world. John, you used to jump out of, I won't say perfectly functioning airplanes because they were Army airplanes.
Air Force.
Air Force, that's true. And Weber, you just like destroying things, large quantities of things.
Oh, anything I can. I mean, yeah, I'm the only guy on the panel who never actually served in the military. Now, friends, family, etc. Yep, lots. I'm the guy the Navy recruiters used to leave notes to about, which was he'll be in the door any day now when he finds out there's a new one. Okay, but nah, they wouldn't take me.
Well, let's just pause a second here to congratulate your son.
Yes, he is reporting for Paris Island on July the 28th.
Very good.
His decision straight out of high school.
I'm still trying to grapple with the concept that the little kid is now a high school graduate and about to join the Marine Corps.
Yeah, time goes by very, very strangely. Because I'm looking at my kids. One of mine has I have a grandson at this point, and
Cherry.
Cherry. You want great grandkids at this point?
Close.
Close. Yeah.
I expect my eldest granddaughter to be married off soon, within a year or so. She's not pregnant.
I remember a pastor of mine who told me, he said, I tell parents they'll have 2 weeks with their kids because that's how long it'll be. When you look back, it will have been 2 weeks. So you really kind of need to make every day of the 2 weeks count. And I always thought that was a fairly profound statement. Now, even more so.
Anyway, that has nothing to do with military science fiction.
No, that's military reality there. But I did want to congratulate him for joining the Marine Corps. And I like the fact that it was his own decision.
Yeah, the judge didn't tell him he had to or anything.
No.
They don't do that anymore. I think it's one of the reasons the military is headed downhill. It's no longer, you're no longer, the judges no longer say, okay, you join the military, you can go to jail. Some of those guys were some of the best troops we had.
It's been over 30 years since that was permitted.
Colonel Barzy told me, okay, while he's in boot camp, you need to send him a letter addressed to Colonel Michael Rice Weber and put a big lipstick kiss on the back and soak it in perfume. He says he will be a marked man in the service for
not forever. It ends when basic or boot camp is over. But
so I was at Benning, and my parents were living in Atlanta at the time. My parents were World War II generation. And my dad had been Army Reserve for years, got the Bronze Star at the Battle of the Bulge, blowing up bridges. And my mom had been around service military families her whole time in the Red Cross. So they knew the deal. So they sent me a care package. I got this big box when I was in basic. And, of course, the drill sergeant, opened it up. And it's like, they sent me peanut M&Ms. He goes, did they send enough for everybody? And I pull out these 3 huge bags of peanut M&Ms and go, yep, think so. That's something that I have never included in any of my books is care packages.
Yeah.
And I just realized that I've left out a major military item in all of my books. So when I eventually get back to writing, I'm going to have to write that in. There will be care packages.
You weren't there for the first Gulf, were you?
No, I was called up for it, but didn't go.
I was attached to 24th ID, which is also what I've been assigned to when I was company commander. And they were getting like 27 tons a day of soldier mail. It was a big pile, maybe 15 feet high in the middle of the desert that the troops wouldn't touch, because if you touched it, yeah, there might be something in there you want, but there's also going to be a letter, and you're going to have to answer the people who sent this thing, and we didn't want to do that. It just went up and up and up. And the Army didn't want to say stop, even though, roughly a third of the supply requirement, transportation-wise, of the division was any soldier mail. No, they couldn't do that because that would be bad for the home front. So this shit just kept building and building and building, and nobody wanted it.
All right, and for those of you that are watching and on the LibertyCon Discord channel, we are monitoring it. John, if people are already asking if your beard is real.
Yep, it's real. I'm not seeing the Discord channel, so.
You have to bring it up separately.
Okay, but yeah, it's a real beard. It's the real thing. I just decided to let it grow out.
Yes. So let's get started on here. The first question I want to ask is for each of you, what got you started with your interest in military science fiction? Who were you reading when you were young? David?
Gilgamesh. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Are you talking about who got me interested in
military science fiction? Yeah.
Military science fiction as
Correct.
opposed to well, the very first science fiction novel that I ever read, I wouldn't call it military science fiction, although it had supposed to be military components, was The Legion of Space. I think probably the first person writing military science fiction that really imprinted on me was probably Piper, H. Bean Piper. And then, of course, there was Gordy Dixon with his Dorsai, and everything else. It's really difficult for me to remember who would have been the real formative writers then, because I read so much of everything. If you see what I'm saying.
Yeah. Tom, who was it for you?
Actual military science fiction?
Yeah.
Probably Star Watchman, Ben Bova. Panzer Grenadiers in space. Hence the song that I was playing a little bit earlier for everyone's entertainment.
Yes.
There's Chuck. He's here.
And
hello.
joins us.
You need
Better
to
late
adjust
than
your
never.
camera a little bit.
Yeah, I've been working behind the curve all day long.
Most current history. There wasn't that much military science fiction. I didn't find Starship Troopers till I was in maybe the 9th grade.
What? John, who was it for you?
Well, first science fiction book I ever read was Grey Lensman in a British version, which is why I still spell Grey with an E. And that's more space opera. It was military-ish.
Yeah.
But first real science fiction, combat science fiction book that was noticeable for me was Starship Troopers. And that was very formative. And then Gordon Dixon, as previously noted, not so much Ben Bova.
He didn't do that much of it.
David Drake. I read all the Slammer stuff. And then as I got closer to where I was actually writing, as opposed to being younger, there was this guy you never heard of called David Weber that I read a lot of.
That hack?
I've heard about that turkey. I mean,
Yeah.
Oh, is that the guy that put cats in outer space? Yeah.
Hey, they wouldn't let me put them. Well, never mind. We won't go there.
Yeah. And then he jumped the shark with 30,000 words on tree cat sign language, and I stopped reading him.
Okay. It's going to be one of those panels, isn't it? Yeah, all right. So Chuck Gannon's joining us a little bit late, Masters of Military Science Fiction. Chuck, the first question was, in your formative years, what was your first real exposure to military science fiction that made you go, oh, this is cool?
I'd read some things before, and although I wouldn't call it exactly military science fiction, Gordon R. Dixon's Tactics of Mistake grounded so much stuff that was by comparison to that. Yeah, Dorsai in general, but Tactics of Mistake, I was 13, and what I'd read beforehand was sort of very space opera-ish, and then all of a sudden something really gritty sort of comes right across my desk, and I'm like, okay, I got to find more of this. And I think the next thing I found after it was the predictable Starship Troopers, and I was done. That was it.
Well, I think it also kind of the fact that I mentioned Legion of Space, John. You mentioned Smith. It kind of goes to the definition of what's the difference between military science fiction and other genres.
Yeah.
And I think there is a distinct difference. It's for some people, it's one of those things of I don't know how to define it, but I know what it is when I see it.
Right.
Okay.
Like going to the Supreme Court.
Yes, that kind of thing. Yes, that was not exactly the simile I was reaching for, but it will do. Okay.
Quite functional. Quite functional.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about Toni Weisskopf's differentiation. She was like, there's a difference between military science fiction and militaristic science, military science fiction. And military science fiction is science fiction written by people who have at least some clue about how the military really works.
Right.
And who is interested in portraying how military organizations really work. And militaristic science fiction is written by people who don't have a clue but decide they want to write a book with blowing up starships or something.
Well, we were talking about Starship Troopers, and of course, Heinlein. That has been an incredibly influential book for the entire genre. But I want to go back a little bit earlier because I think my first exposure to what I consider military science fiction was Space Cadet, because it was a military organization.
Yes, Heinlein did a number. One of the earlier ones, I read it around the same time that I was reading a lot of military science fiction in middle school. Jim Bain used to say that the golden age of science fiction is 13-year-old male, and it was certainly the case with me. But the early Hugo Awards had a number of stories in them which were military. One of them, I did an anthology on military science fiction called Citizens, where all of the authors had to have been in the military.
I remember that.
And oh my God, I can't remember the name of the story. It's like Fiddly Bump or something like that. But it's a story about, and it was an early Hugo winner, and it was a story about a ship that has been on a very, very long mission, and it's coming back, and it's got to go through an inspection. And they have to have all the equipment that they're supposed to have. Off-fog, or have a survey of loss already done. And they're going through and inventorying everything, and it was so perfectly military because that's really what the military is all about. We always write about battles and everything, but really the military is about pulling inventory and mopping. That's pretty much it, okay?
98% of the time it is. There's something else in military science fiction, and I just keyed to this recently. In a romance, the romance is a character, right? In military science fiction, the organization is a character, the plan is a character, the preparation is a character, and the battle is a character.
Yeah. But in Off-Fog, they can't find this one particular device. And they're turning the ship upside down, as you do for any inventory before an IG, trying to find this one freaking device, and they can't find it anywhere. So they come up with this box that just has blinky lights on the front of it, and it passes the inspection. But next they've got to go and have a complete survey and a rebuild of the ship, and the engineers will know that it's not the Off-Fog. So they send a signal that they send a message that the Off-Fog was destroyed by gravitational anomaly by passing between two stars. and they make a mistake in the message, and they send off dog, as in the official dog on board has come apart due to gravitation.
And the dog is watching all of it, watching the inventory, which I figure out, and you never quite key onto it until the end.
And it shuts down like the entire Space Navy because there has to be a review to find out why the official dog came apart. And it was so perfectly military, right? It's just how militaries work.
This is kind of a two-part question because it affects the people that have both served and have not served. So it's kind of a reverse question for David as it is for Tom and John. Chuck, I don't actually know your military background, if any.
None. I've done consulting inside the Beltway for a long time, but this very day I have a son who, if all goes well, is coming off a Cole Range to join the Ranger Battalion. He has his tab already, and he's an E5 coming out of the 173rd Airborne. So things are looking good, but until it's happened, it hasn't. That's cross fingers, not a different kind of sign. And so just waiting.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
All right. So this is for Chuck and David, and then for John Tom. Here's the question. The question is for Chuck and David, has your lack of military background impeded or affected your writing? For Tom and John, the reverse. Has your military background affected or impeded your writing?
There's a lot of things I can't write with a straight face. I won't write them if I know they just don't work.
Yeah, I could see that. I don't know that it's impeded me. It has made me worry more about whether or not I'm getting something straight. Now, given the number of folks who are current and past active service and the amount of time that I've spent with military history and so forth, I don't stay up at night worrying about it. Mm-hmm. I know I can find what I need, and that even people who have actually been there are going to get story details wrong because of the way that it's going to be read by somebody who A, doesn't have any military background, or B, has some but misunderstands what was being said. So I don't think it's impeded me. I think it has caused me sometimes to spend more time doing research and research includes calling up your brother-in-law who was in the Marines for 23 years and saying, should I call it the crotch or the suck in this passage, kind of thing. John?
So I guess for me, I would say that, I wouldn't say it's impeded me. It has definitely made me aware of places I will go and I won't go, in that I have personal experiences that I feel might be able to translate well into it. I'm a child of World War II veterans, and we're not just talking, we're not talking rear echelon. One of my uncles was the only person to survive his squad at Salerno, and et cetera, Aleutians, the whole thing. So it was part of my family and the beginning since, and then although it passed over me for reasons, that's a different thing, different story. I've already said that in this sort of panel before, but now two of my boys are in. Yeah. And so what I'm aware of is this. I've had enough of those moments where it's like, shit, I'm going to die next. But I haven't. Here's one thing I don't think I have had, and I think to go back to what Tom and John were both pointing to, is it is the utter boredom and banality of so much of day-to-day life in the military that my sons report to me all the time, that I only graze past that because I've not lived it. I've not lived something that sort of remorseless in its presence in my life, and all the things that you see people evolve to deal with it. So I acknowledge it. I write it as well as I can. I put it in front of readers who've been there, but I don't. That's one of the places where I'm careful, because I don't. That's something I don't have. I don't have any sort of personal. I don't have enough of a personal connection to that to really feel like I have a decent instinct for whether I'm getting it right or not. So I go to people who can tell me.
Now, Tom and John, you're coming from the opposite end, because I've read John Campbell once said that knowing too much about a subject can be an impediment to telling a good story. Have you ever run into that?
No.
Okay.
No. For one thing, I I didn't spend that much time in the military, so I don't necessarily know what goes on in meetings with generals.
Right.
And lieutenant colonels sitting around and trying to one up each other about getting a particular program passed. Okay?
We were John. We were E4 Mafia. I mean, come on,
We're E4 Mafia. We are still E4 Mafia. Damn it! Once E4 Mafia, always E4 Mafia.
No,
Got to get that rubber chicken
once you get commission.
Unless you get a commission, in which case you're tossed out of the E4 Mafia as a traitor.
Yeah.
Kratman he is ex E4 Mafia. He is not former E4 Mafia. He is ex E4 Mafia. He was court-martialed upon his acceptance of lieutenancy. So, no, I've never found that knowing too much about it. Okay, one way that knowing too much about it, my daughters comment on, because they've tried to read some of my earlier books, and there's so many acronyms in them.
Yeah.
That is, I've gotten away from acronyming. Pretty much.
You have to.
One of the things that I find,
if you'd spent 20 years in, you'd have learned to hate acronyms so much you wouldn't touch them.
On top of which, they change so much. I had to
they
do something.
change so much, right?
Holy God! 1945. I was looking at all the sort of instructions that are given from turret to bridge on a ship and something like that. You look at what all the glossary is today. There's almost no overlap.
No.
Some basic navigational stuff, but everything else is completely altered.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've found difficult recently is that the nature of infantry combat is changing so fast that the stuff that I wrote in the post-Lean Wars, or even that we wrote in March Up Country, they didn't have drones.
Yeah.
They didn't have drones. And now it's like, why didn't they have drones? They would have had drones. It's very unrealistic. The drones wouldn't have lasted very long.
Yeah.
But they would have had them. So, when they were in the first city, who's Kunkok or whatever, when they're sneaking around and doing stuff and planting bugs, you would have just used teeny tiny little drones to do that.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like me. I wrote the first two Honor Harrington novels a year and a half before Al Gore invented the internet. Okay, so there were my starting assumptions these days would be hugely different, and 25 years down the road, they'd be just as obsolete as where I began that series. Then
I was having a conversation with someone from DARPA about 25 years ago. And this someone talked about those very same little drones. And I asked him, do you know what an infantry platoon does to prepare a building for defense in city fighting? And he really didn't. I said, well, okay, in the first place, they're going to burn everything that's wooden and exposed and then put it out. So it's hard for it to catch fire again. They're going to block up every, natural window or door, and they're going to create their own. But you know what else they're going to do as soon as they realize these drones exist? And he's, know what? And I said, flypaper. And crickets on the other end. The fuckers had never considered flypaper. So
there's another thing that I'm not sure that there is outdated just because the drones aren't there, because from where I've sat, usually in rooms in the Beltway where these sort of topics come up in discussion, one of the first things that you really quickly come across is that if it's not line of sight, if it's not essentially LASCOM, even if it's AI, the bottom line is if it can communicate, and if it has to communicate, now you're in that gray zone of here's how we send our messages, here's how we encrypt them, here's how we go back and forth between wavelengths or whole different spectrum bands in order to do it. But you don't always know what the other guy has. And the bottom line is you could be sending something out which comes back at you, or it doesn't have to come back at you. As I saw Tom, shaking his finger, and I thought he was going to the place of, you're really going to let drones go out to plant essentially bugs. Well, if you're actually depending on that as part of your sort of tactical profile, and it doesn't work, you won't necessarily even know. And there's a whole bunch of places where you want boots on the ground. That is. There's
a whole field here to discuss having to do with, we are fighting in a science fiction environment at this point. Yep. I mean, one of the things that I was saying for years is I hate my job because what am I supposed to? I'm supposed to be coming up with new stuff and every jerk with ADHD on the Pacific Rim is coming up with stuff faster than I can. So we're in a combat science fiction environment, and one of the things that when we deal with a pure adversary, one of the things that's going to happen is an awful lot of hacking. Yeah. I mean, to the extent that pretty much would be the story.
I think one of the issues that the U.S. military especially has to be aware of, and I think is the fact that we haven't really been in the field against peer competitors in quite some time. And it's real easy to say, okay, well, we've got this cushion of superiority and build your operational, your tactical doctrine around that, and then suddenly find out that, well, we don't have that anymore, which can be, I expect, could be a very painful awakening for a lot of people. And what I'm most concerned about is the political leadership for whom it would be a profoundly painful awakening.
And the people that
there's an awful lot of lip service to our peer adversaries have strengths that we have not reinforced and that sort of thing. And we need to focus on cyber defense, and we need to focus on this. There's an awful lot of lip service to it, and when it gets down to brass tacks, when it gets down to actual implementation, it's going to take a whole nother. It's going to take the guys who are currently majors making it to general and 4-star general before there are people who are serious about it.
Well, I hate to say this, but historically, militaries respond to what bites them on the ass, and until it bites them on the ass, then what we've got works.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And I have to say, there's an element of respectable reasoning to that, because the last thing you need to do is to throw out what works in favor of a panacea that doesn't work. Yeah. The problem is that the more senior you get, the less directly related you are to what's going to bite you on the ass next week, because you're defending the doctrine works against everybody who's going off in 9 million directions at once, and everybody's got the right answer. The right answer's in there somewhere. Okay, but how do you separate it out of the chaff?
I think one of the things that's involved with that, also talking about out of touch, when I've had the opportunity to do so, my attitude has been, we shouldn't be talking about this until we have an E5 in the room or plus, or the equivalent from other services, because they know what's really going to happen. They know what's going on out there. They know what troops are going to use or not. One of the other things that seems to me, I just to riff off something John was saying about the real story is going to be essentially probably a 19 millisecond hack war, and that's the story. And to riff off that, that reminds me.
And it's not just going to be directed at the military.
Oh no, no. As a matter of fact, definitely not. Absolutely not. But the same sort of thing. There's a parallel that I've heard people talking about that maybe we should reapproach from an entirely different level of energy spectrum. Instead of electron, in the old days, we were worried about essentially hard radiation and massive thermonuclear disruptions. Now we're talking about far more focused things, so to speak. But when you think about it, the idea of, so there's a nuclear war, and if there's anything left, if it's a limited nuclear war, if the entire POMCUS notion of what was going on in Europe and the idea that there would be a war to fight after that war, that's, I think, a lot probably what that immediate post-hacking situation would look like. What's left? What works? What do we do? How do we find out what they have? And I think it would be that same sort of come as you are party, find your ass with your hand in a dark closet sort of thing.
One of the things you mentioned, Chuck, too, is not having an E5 in the room. And I see that in a good bit of military science fiction. It seems to focus on, the leaders a lot. And sometimes people forget that most of this thing's going to be done by privates who will break anything humanly possible in ways that nobody predicted.
And will break the shit they don't like purposely.
Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure this isn't a classified story. Okay.
Here we go.
If your signal blanks, we'll know why.
Yeah. 10 years
Speaking of
ago, there was a test at Fort Bliss. If you've been following the recent battles in Armenia, one of the things with drones, and one of the reasons that there's a whole other area I'd like to talk about, is there were videos of these drones, and squads are diving into bunkers, and then the drones drop down, fly into the bunkers, and there's this as everyone in the bunker dies. Okay. And it's like, okay, we've got to figure out something to do about drones. 10 years ago, somebody that we all know was with a Beltway Bandit, and there was a test out at Fort Bliss of anti-drone systems. And the company that he was with had developed a directed energy weapon, high-energy microwave direct anti-drone system, that the big problem was spotting the drones with radar, because drones have a tendency to look a lot like birds. But they finally figured out how to separate drones and birds. And so they went out there, and the other group that was there had a drone that had a 30 millimeter light cannon on it. And it would fly around trying to find the other drones and shoot them. And the biggest problem it had was it had a teeny tiny little camera on it, and it couldn't find the drones. So the directed energy weapon guys were like, okay, well, look, just use our radar to find the drones. So they were directing their drones in using their radar. So this thing flies around and finally shoots down a drone. It's like, yay! And it's okay, it's time for the do guys. And enemy drones come up. There were 7 of them. They hit a button, 7 drones dropped. So they put up some more drones, the drones dropped. And the guys at Fort Bliss were like, this is freaking amazing. But can you get them to explode? Because we've got to sell this to Congress. Well, they couldn't get them to explode, so nobody would give them money. So this thing kind of went off by the wayside. If you keep up with recent military news, the Army just announced a new microwave energy directed energy weapon, which is exactly the same thing that was deployed 10 years ago.
Yep.
There's no difference to it at all. It's the same radar, it's the same do, it's the same everything. It's like, okay, so we waited 10 years to finally realize, after we've seen this stuff from Azerbaijan and Armenia, that yeah, this is a real problem. The recent Iron Dome kerfuffle, where the PLO fired a 10th Weber of missiles at Israel, and Israel responded with a fractional Ringo of interceptors. There was a video that the subject matter experts, you're talking about, you got to have an E5 in the room. Okay, these are referred to as subject matter experts, or as generals refer to them, smart mouth and enlisted. Because generals kind of, it goes into one ear and out the other, because it's an enlisted man, and generals don't listen to enlisted. But they had created a video that showed Iron Dome operating exactly as it worked. It was so realistic that it looked like a news video. They actually had news. Iron Dome is firing and intercepting all these things. The generals watched this thing and went, okay, great. Then it actually happened. They went, wait, what? That actually works?
Yeah.
Yes, General, it actually works. So the problem is that, like I talked about, I have a hard time keeping up with modern combat because my last real experience with it was in the 1980s. It's so different now, it's psychotic, okay? Generals have a hard time keeping up with it because their last experience with it was 25, 35 years ago when they were lieutenants. And no general truly gets out of being a lieutenant. So until the majors of today, because lieutenants had started to grasp it, until the majors today are generals, they really won't have a solid grasp on what's going on. And by then, it will have gone beyond them. So that's one of the problems. It's a lag time. It's experiential lag time. Anyway, somebody else.
Well, the best one can hope is that your competitors will be experiencing their own
the
version.
same problem.
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah.
There's something that's generally true of war. Anything that works will invite a reaction fairly quickly and in accordance with how well it works. So I'm not too worried about drones or EMP or directed EMP or this or that, because it doesn't matter. It'll all get neutralized.
Yeah.
They
I remember.
cancel out.
Well, you were talking about tactics and mistake. The whole basis of the Dorsai universe was that electronic warfare had gotten so advanced that nothing complicated worked.
Yeah.
Right. So everything had to go back to just being infantrymen with simple rifles.
I wish that I could remember the book. It was a serious look at nuclear warfare and whatnot that was written in the late 80s, mid 90s.
Volume, the updated version of On Thermonuclear War, Herman Kahn?
No, it wasn't. But the opening sentence of the book is that in any massive nuclear exchange, the first victim will be a neutral power targeted by mistake, and only the designers of the system will be surprised. And I thought that was an interesting look at, because one of the things that this book was featuring on was the faith in technology of the people who were designing the systems on both sides, and the faith that they knew what would work and what wouldn't work, without anybody having actually tested the delivery systems against a peer opponent or whatever.
Well, we've all dealt with that, especially when I was in. They were developing the Sergeant York and the MLRS. The MLRS worked beautifully well. The Sergeant York was a debacle, but on paper they both looked good.
Yeah. The Sergeant York was one of those classics that you got to love. It almost wiped out the Senate Armed Services Committee.
Darn.
Yeah.
Came so close.
I was in the Army when they did the Sergeant York test, and the story came out about it. Tried to track on the bleachers and shoot everybody that was on the bleachers, and went, "You hit the off button too soon."
Nobody was surprised. Nobody was surprised except the designers.
Yeah.
Who remembers the awful Chris Christopherson TV America with the Soviet conquest of the U.S.? Okay.
Oh yes, with the K.
When they blew up the Congress building when the KGB did it, kind of thing. I remember Steve White calling me that evening and saying, "Well, at least it had a happy ending."
All right, time to move on.
I can hear him say that.
Time to move on. We have a question from Discord. Draven asked, how many of your characters are based off of actual people in your military SF books?
All of them.
Most.
Damn near all.
Yeah.
I would say it depends on what you mean by based off of an actual person. Do you mean, did I take someone who I knew and insert them? Did I take a historical figure and insert them? Not very damn many. Did I take someone I knew and incorporate part of their experience and who they were into the character? Almost everybody. Many, many years ago, I was told by a friend of mine who is since deceased, who was drafted for the Korean War, stayed in, was first class special forces at Bragg, the whole 9 yards, and reached colonel's rank before he ultimately retired. But he told me that the second worst moment in a combat commander's life came when the intel was good, the plan was good, you rehearsed the troops, everybody was well trained, everybody executed almost flawlessly, all of your objectives were attained, and you had a 19-year-old bleeding out in your arms and you could not put the life back into him. And I said, and that's the second worst moment. He said, yep. I said, what's the worst? He said, when you realize that this is what you do best in the world and you do it better than anybody else. And that's an element that I've tried to incorporate into quite a few of my characters, is why they are doing this despite the personal cost to them of not just their own people that they've lost, but ultimately everybody who's died in the operations that they're conducting. And he said, basically, you have to learn how to turn that on and off when it's decision-making time, because otherwise it just paralyzes you. There's nothing you can do.
Right. You've either got to be a sociopath or someone who can compartmentalize really well.
Yeah.
Yes,
and he said you have to be able to turn it back on or you cease being a human being.
Mm.
for me, one of the places where borrowing from people has been really invaluable, and actually it turned into something that I discovered was part of what's an ongoing sort of sub theme, I guess you could say. Not really intentional. When you put themes in by intention, you're going down the wrong path. That's my basic feeling. But that watching and knowing so many people who have entered the profession, let's say from the late 70s onward, and how very different that is from what I grew up hearing, who were from, everybody was enlisted, everybody was drafted, and it was a come as you are party, and your adversaries were like something out of a book, that if you represented peer aggressors today on the nature, some of the black and white aspects of difference that Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan had, you'd almost get your stuff laughed at. It's like, oh my God, that's so reductive. Oh my God, that's so obvious. Well, that was whether or not it was the case. The bottom line was they believed it, and those who actually got near to it, particularly in the ATO, they don't have a lot of argument with those extreme representations of the difference between the two sides. But the idea of somebody, one of the people in my past who comes into my fiction often is a guy by the name of Ian Clark, who was, I won't go into his background. He wrote some really interesting nonfiction books about military science fiction. Voices Prophesying War, it's called. And he had been in the special boat squads in the Mediterranean in the dark English days of early World War One. And the stories he tells...
One or two?
World War II. World War II.
Yeah.
World War II. And the perspective is so different. I mean, there's so many things that are the same between somebody who, let's say, my own kids who upped, right? And the people they bring into the house and the people I meet through them and all that. It is a very different mindset, despite the similarities from which they spring. And one of the things that I've found gratifying and motivating for me is to portray both of those in some of my fiction at the same time.
Well, I think
was
that
one of the things that came up on a panel where Tom, myself, and Drake were all on the panel.
Mm-hmm.
Was the difference in style and tone.
One of the things that I've had
between different groups, people who've been in the military at different time frames. Drake was in the military during the Vietnam War. He was draftee. He was surrounded by draftees, and all of his stuff is very, very grim, very, very dystopic. Tom preceded me in the military, and his stuff is, from the point of view of the military, his stuff is much grimmer than mine. By the time I came along, the U.S. military was starting to come out of the hollow army period, and it was the Reagan era, and there was a lot more hope about it. It wasn't just that we had money. It was this is a cause worth fighting for. This is a group worth being a member of. Be all you can be. And then I'm kind of looking forward to seeing the military science fiction that starts being produced by the people who are in the global war on terror. Because I think that's going to be a very interesting perspective that they will have. And it would be much more along the lines of drones and robots. And I think the future of infantry warfare, is robots.
Yeah. Well, I have to say that from a sociological viewpoint, the transition from the mass armies, because we're really producing much smaller armies, even when we're talking about all up formations, maneuver formations, but also simply the fact that when I was growing up, military experience was almost a given throughout society, either firsthand or secondhand. And now the military is once again kind of into the niche that it was in for the Republic for most of our existence, which is it is a subset of our populace. It's a subset of our citizens, and I think,
and usually family groups too.
Yes, it is. But I think in some ways, what we're looking at is a separation between the military and the civilians that it serves. I think that mass media and so forth may help to bridge some of that gap.
If anything, it's creating a wider bridge.
Well, I think it is. I'm sorry, I said mass media. I meant social media. But yeah, you're right. There is this
Gulf.
division between us and them, that even all these people who are we thank you for your service, et cetera, but who don't actually have skin in the game, are in
politicians
a whole.
support the military until it's time to pay us.
No, I'm not talking just about politicians. I'm talking
people.
about the people in general.
Yeah.
And I personally think that that's one reason to write military science fiction, is to bridge some of that gap. I mean, I've said this before at a lot of conventions. Americans' actual personal experience with violence as a society is very limited compared to an awful lot of places around the planet. And that means that an awful lot of Americans form their idea of what violence is and what actual armed conflict is vicariously. What they read, what they see, etc. That kind of gives us a responsibility to try and get it right.
When my son who just commissioned, so I've got one E5, I've got another one who just came out of ROTC, and the good sign was the people who liked him best in the cadre were all the NCOs. But when he gets out, what he wants to do is he wants to work in media someplace to show the terrible distinctions between how Hollywood presents military life, military experience, what it is like to be in combat with the reality of it. And that's something. And I actually want to pick up on a comment that Tom made. But Tom made this comment, I think, 6 or 7 years ago at RavenCon. And you're talking about this divide. And I remember this conversation really well, because one of the things that I think we were talking about in the room was the idea of the citizen soldier, and how do you do it, and how do you even then, the concern with this divide between the general populace and those who serve. And I remember saying, I would really like to see that if that was somehow mandated, if we went to some of that model. And Tom said something which stuck with me to this day, because damn it, it's true. And I've actually bent my brain about the question of how could we use it. But he said they'd be in the way, given the way. And this gets to this idea of what John was saying about the nature of infantry combat, the nature of combat in general is so remarkably different that you have to rate well above journeyman to not be a problem to your own side. And I've seen that from my standpoint. I remember being in a room in something called NATO 2030, and the unspoken truth, but the thing that was absolutely operating in the room is we can achieve interoperability, Air Force-wise, to some degree with the Brits. Everybody else, it's like, how do we find another way to do this? How do we find a way to use them? Because we can't plug them in.
They're just in the way.
There's no way to plug them in. So this idea of this divide is something that's been around a long time. And thank you, Colonel Prattman, because you gave me something to think about that I've been thinking about since then.
Well, one of the things that I foresee in the near future, and I've talked about with a number of people who are current military, and they're like, is we're going further and further away from. The way I phrased it on one of the panels was the latter period of Iraq, they would put a robot on point for a platoon, and the robot would go out first to take fire. And so you'd see it's a robot with a platoon. The next thing you'll see is it's a robot with a squad. Then it's a robot with a fire team. Then it's a fire team of robots with a guy to make sure that the robots keep working. And then it's a platoon of robots with a guy with a lieutenant in charge of a platoon of robots. And eventually it's a battalion of robots. And these robots might be, what we think of as robots. Anybody who has not seen the Now That I Can Dance video, have all of you seen this video?
Oh, you mean the one Boston, the one up in Boston?
Boston Dynamics. Have you seen this?
People are scared.
Mighty. Holy.
Okay, Tom, have you seen it?
I don't think so.
When I saw the Boston Dynamics Atlas robot a while back, I went, okay.
Oh yeah, I saw that.
Okay, but it's all the robots dancing, and I'm watching this and I'm going, all we need is a power source, and there's no point. But the problem becomes one of the reasons that a side quits in war is casualties.
Yeah.
And if all that you are sacrificing is robots, where's the casualties?
Yeah, well, combat.
Robots, as long as there's people involved, they're going to be, and they're important. They're going to be the target for the other side of robots.
You're getting through the machines to get to the crunchies inside. Combat has been about machines breaking machines more and more ever since World War One. I mean, if you come down
Napoleonic.
to it, well, no, not machines breaking machines.
Not so much.
Cannons.
No,
they didn't do much counter battery.
No,
very, very little counter battery.
Well, okay, counter battery. But what I'm talking about here is the intrusion, if you will, of mechanized elements into combat, of making the cutting edge of your direct fire combat rely upon machinery more and more to increase firepower, but simultaneously to decrease industrial warfare is machines breaking machines. Okay, and we are now moving beyond to post-industrial warfare, where the industry
electronic.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's an inevitable part of the cycle. When you're in the middle of it, you never see where it's going to end. You only realize where it's going to end when you moved on to the next cycle, because you know now where that cycle ended. And there'll be some general or admiral who is insisting that it hasn't ended, and will probably be right to at least some extent.
Okay, we've been talking a lot about infantry and that sort of thing, but one element of military science fiction that has a lot of appeal is the science fiction, in space combat, basically naval in space. No, Dave, you wouldn't know anything about that.
No, I did nothing.
But what is it? What do you think the appeal is on that, and what is the future of that? Because we're talking in most of this conversation, we're talking about grunts and people like that. But when you're dealing with space combat, you can especially John, David, you guys are dealing with fleets of things.
I think in many respects of the four of us, the one who has done the best, at least in a relatively near future context, is Chuck in the Riordan-verse.
Yes.
Because if you look at the technology that he's laying out and so forth, it's not set as far in the future as mine is, in terms of what the base Clark's Law technology is going to be. And in John's case, there's this infusion of technology from a Clarkian level of technology with the Atalanta and that whole cycle. So I think really of the lot of us, Chuck probably is operating in the envelope where present day capabilities are going to express into directly analogous space combat.
You got mail.
What the heck?
Somebody got mail.
Yeah, I don't know which of it is, but
Somebody's
AOL. AOL, really? Okay, so much for modern technology.
I hate fucking change. Okay, AOL was the standard when I was practicing law. When I learned to be I don't use a computer at all, and I'm not changing.
Okay, unfortunately, I have not read Chuck's Riordans, I'll admit. But for people who want to see a pretty good example of that, not too far in the future, The Expanse.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, let's give all the credit in the world to the television production for staying very close to the books.
To the books and the short stories, yeah, absolutely.
I like the fact. What I like most about The Expanse, John and I talked about this when we first watched it, was how much of real science they got into it.
Yeah.
And the physics of it. This is amazing.
There's a scene in it where Amos, who is everyone's favorite character,
yes,
and a scientist who's gotten attached to the crew briefly, are in a compartment when the scientist has not latched down the tools, and they're going through maneuvers, and suddenly metal tools are flying all over the compartment, and it's a very dangerous moment.
Yes.
And it was just so beautiful because you could see that exact thing occurring in that type of environment. But yeah, I love it. Anyway, Chuck.
One of the things that you were talking about in terms of terrestrial combat, the idea of it evolves to the point where there's a lieutenant and a battalion or a platoon of robots. That's very quickly. I started one of the places example. I love Battlestar Galactica, but the idea of having human piloted ships that you then have to be on station to retrieve, my gosh, I mean the morale effects, the way you lose your entire flight wing if you can't stick around long enough to get them back on board. If you're dealing with essentially, reactionless drives and all that sort of, then maybe, yeah. But if you're dealing with standard thrust and you gotta tumble and come back home and counter your thrust, the only thing I could see was what I called the finger, wrist, elbow thing, which is out here are the drones. Back here is a two-person, very fast craft that would be called a fighter, but it's really a forward operator vehicle. And back at the elbow is actually where the heavy duty ships are. But the expendability, the fragility of things in space, that H.G. Wells law that essentially defense increases arithmetically, whereas destructive energies increase exponentially or geometrically. I forget which one he used, but they both make the point. Man, in space, that is just that much more. That's just much more of an impact factor because it's so fragile to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Well, gentlemen, we're going to need to wrap things up here in a few minutes. Final thoughts, David.
Oh, I don't have any. Really,
what did you do with David?
Yeah, no. I was just going to say, this panel has bounced around. It's covered a lot of stuff. I think all of it has been valid, and we have only scratched the surface.
Tom, final thoughts.
Ultimately, war never changes.
How so?
Because it's the placing of two wills in opposition to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
As long as that's true, then the wills don't change because they come from the people who don't change. Then war really fundamentally won't change. A little the techniques will, the technology will. War won't.
All right, John. Final thoughts, John.
All conflict is about control, whether it's a husband and wife arguing over the dishes or global thermonuclear war. And therefore, war doesn't change because war is always about changing the will of the opponent. And it's just a matter of how you do that.
All right. Chuck, final thoughts.
Final thought would be the last two commentators have just actually given a boost to the entire Fallout franchise, which always begins with war. War never changes. So they're going to want to get their hands on this, I think. I think my take would be I find a great purpose in what I do, and what I'm intuiting is all four of us and those beyond. It is so easy when there are so many machines to lose sight of the human factors of war, such as the will that's being that both Tom and John spoke about, but also just all the other factors, the way the notion of it impacts us, and the way different technology and times change it, but also there's that core that really doesn't change at all. Yeah. And I think, as somebody said earlier, I think it was David, military science fiction may be one of the things that actually tries to keep some sort of discourse with the sort of thin Hollywood versions of this somehow grounded to something that is of human value and reality.
Well, I want to thank all of you gentlemen, David Weber, Tom Kratman, Chuck Gannon, and John Ringo, for joining us here in the virtual LibertyCon Masters of Military Science Fiction. And I want to point out one thing, because this is LibertyCon. I just want to touch on one thing. Global thermonuclear war is a game. Spades is serious. So thank you very much, gentlemen. And several of us will be over on Discord after this if you have any further questions. We just want to thank everybody for taking part in a virtual LibertyCon, and we hope to see all of you in person next year, because this is not the kind of weekend I was looking forward to.
But DragonCon will be.
Yes, and I will be there. Absolutely.
And I will not. I will not be at DragonCon.
It's too frigging big. Too noisy.
Gentlemen,
and the girls, who admittedly are very attractive, aren't attractive enough to justify putting up with the confusion, the stress, the noise.
You just find someplace comfortable to sit and watch.
And now we know that Tom is officially ours.